Good morning. So this is a technical presentation. I'm going to introduce talk a little bit about which balls it is we're rolling and which ones we think are about to come down again. Of course, the UK is a very inspiring place to prepare for a roadmap presentation. I don't know if you did you get past, those of you who rented cars? You managed to get past this place, obviously. I congratulate you. But actually, our roadmap, I think is a bit more boring at the moment. We're basically keeping on trucking. We're doing pretty much what we said we would do 2 years ago, and what we said we would do 1 year ago. In fact, Scholes, I think, eventually got very tired of redoing his presentations about what we were eventually going to put into version 14. We had a very long period of talking about what we were going to do. The horizon is a little bit further away than some of us, perhaps particularly I thought. Or maybe it's the top of that hill that's a bit further away. We've just released a very large release, version 14.0, and we're really getting into a rhythm now of doing a big release and then a 14.1, which is a bit of a catch-up. So I'll risk a bit of retrospection here again. I think if you look at the pattern, we sort of, every couple of years in this 10-year period, we're looking back to the last UK user meeting in 2003. Sort of every other year, very roughly, we've released a major upgrade, major new language feature. So object orientation, as Gitte said, to make it easy to communicate with everybody else who's object-oriented. There are also cases where object orientation is a good tool of thought for APL programmers, but I think most people really find the object orientation as a good way of organizing data, organizing your code, and presenting it to C# programmers or Java programmers, people out there. 64-bit, of course, that's actually nearly 10 years since we did that work. You can have unlimited arrays now in unlimited workspaces and unlimited component files as well. The Unicode support, which I think is really critical again in integrating APL into everybody's development environments and data environments. Get rid of the character translation issues once and for all. And then some new data types to extend the capabilities of computational algorithms. And that sort of business as usual, that's what Dyalog's been doing for 30 years. One of the things that we've been ramping up increasingly in the last few years in particular is adding tools. So not just being a core language, core interpreter vendor, but also adding integration to .NET. We're working on Java now as well. TCP sockets, staying ahead of the curve with IPv6 and secure sockets, XML, etc., etc. And that's something which I think will be an increasing trend. We'll probably see a shift, more and more resource being spent on that, because the interpreter is really becoming very, very mature now in terms of language capabilities, I think. One of the things I'm going to try and do as I go through is highlight when there are going to be presentations on some of these things, in case you're particularly interested in something you see. So the only one I'm going to highlight here, because this is mostly work that's already been done, there is a presentation on Tuesday. Nick and Gitte will be talking about the new Sharp Plot chart wizard. Sharp Plot is Adrian Smith's original work that is now bundled with Dyalog APL and gives you business and technical graphics capabilities. The last thing we've done, version 14, quickly recap what's in that. So as Gitte said, for once this was a release with a lot of new language features, so significant new squiggles, operators. We've been looking around at what other, the J, K, and other array-oriented language people have been doing in the past decade or so, and looking for juicy things that they implemented that we thought would be really valuable to provide to you as well for your programming. So the rank operators, the key, which is like an SQL group by feature built into the language, tally, which is just a little bit of cleanup, trains to encourage a more functional style of programming, give you more power, and as Roger's been doing a lot of work on Dyadic IOTA, both speeding it up and extending it to higher rank arrays, so you can do much more in terms of lookups. Performance is becoming a very big theme for us, spending more and more time on that, both the serial, the core performance of the interpreter, and going parallel. And as Gita says, one of the big balls that keep going up and down is trying to adapt to new user interface facilities that the environment throws at us. So we've been looking at WPF and JavaScript. And one thing that, in addition to the tooling and the performance, is becoming a big theme is going cross-platform. Putting us in a position, perhaps these are not so important to you today, but the Androids and the other tablets and phablets that are becoming ubiquitous are going to be important to you in a few years, and we want to be ready with an APL interpreter. So we started work on that in version 14, and there's much more to come. So Dan's going to be doing a workshop on Thursday afternoon, recapping a lot of the new language features. And I'll be talking more about the others, so the introduction to the talks will come later. Performance, as I said, is something that we're really spending a lot of energy on, increasingly, to the point where we have an automated QA, performance QA thing, which runs weekly, and where we compare, this was during the 14 release cycle, we're comparing with version 13.2. And we're running a suite of actually about 14,000 different APL expressions on different data types, which are grouped into about 130 groups of expressions. And this is a very, very high-level view, which simply orders the groups by the fastest ones in the new interpreter on the left and the slowest ones on the right, and allows us to get a big picture of how the new interpreter is generally shaping up compared to the old one. 14.0, I don't know how many of you have started using it yet, but the people who have reports that are anywhere between 10 and 30 or sometimes more % speed up on their applications without changing a line of code. And a lot of that is due to the fact that this bar here, this is actually cut off at about 30%. A lot of these go up through the ceiling as a result of tuning work that Roger has been doing on selected primitives. So Roger's going to be talking about that together with Kimmo Kekalainen later today. Right, now we did get a lot of stuff out in version 14, but we have to admit when we look back at the last couple of years that we do have a significant amount of unfinished business, these things where the horizon turned out to be a little bit further away than we thought. The team as a group has very long experience with putting out new releases of interpreters, new squiggles and so on, but this tools business is still quite new to us, and we're still learning how to really schedule, manage, and not least document that. In fact, we produced about 500 new pages of documentation for version 14.0. The release notes, I think, were a couple of hundred, and then there's sort of 40, 50 page documents on each one of these new things. But in fact, we should have produced about 500 more pages on WPF and various other stuff, I think. And Fiona's going to talk a little bit about, I think perhaps not so much in detail, about what projects, what documentation we're working on. But she's going to be talking about her work this afternoon. The two big things that I feel are unfinished is we've been talking for a while about Windows Presentation Foundation and how we'd really like to make it possible for you to use this latest UI technology from Microsoft. And we have provided the tools. Version 14 has complete capacity to deal with Windows Presentation Foundation and these Sync Fusion libraries that we've also made an agreement to bundle. But we recognize that most of the documentation out there for using that is still, on the internet there are tens of thousands of pages of documentation of how to use WPF, how to use the Sync Fusion libraries. But they're mostly targeted at C# users or users of other .NET programming languages. And we have a task that hopefully some of you will help us with. Michael Hughes is certainly doing a lot of work to help us with that, to provide more information on how to use this. The other user interface direction that we're heading in is to now enable the writing of web applications. We have the goal eventually to make this as easy as Quad WC. We have a new My Server version 3, which didn't quite make it with version 14.0, sorry. Both of these tool sets are being presented at workshops here. Code samples are starting to appear online. Dick Bowman has done a fair amount of work on the WPF stuff, but the documentation is still work in progress, we have to admit. So there's workshops both before and after the conference. I'm doing a talk with Michael on Wednesday morning about the Sync Fusion stuff in particular, and his grid control, WPF grid control. Brian also doing workshops on My Server and a talk tomorrow afternoon. Yeah, sometimes, you know, there's a little bit more to do than you thought. There's a couple of other tools that we've been talking about for a number of conferences. It's a little bit hard for us. You say, why don't they just pick one of these libraries and finish it? And it's hard for us to know. We can see these technologies coming up that we think you're going to need, but it's hard to know exactly how to prioritize them. And perhaps we've sinned a little bit in sort of throwing too many balls up in the air, but we're also trying to, you know, gauge your interest in these features. So we start on things and then we see how quickly you pick them up. So the Dyalog file server, for example, a client-server version of the file system where the files become completely secure because you're not accessing them over the LAN but through TCP/IP, is something that I think is going to be absolutely essential in 5 or 10 years' time when security audits really get serious. Accessing component files over a LAN is going to become unacceptable. So far, we still only have one production user of this. And therefore, you know, we haven't prioritized the work to really get the documentation done and get it out and so on. But these tools are both available. Anybody who wants to get started on them, there's enough documentation for you to get going, but there's not enough documentation for us to really feel that this is done. So it's still considered work in progress, although you can have access to both of these components. Richard is going to talk briefly about the file server on Thursday morning in conjunction with his talk on the rest of his work on the component file system. Björn Christensen, who is our security czar, is going to be giving an introduction to the whole subject of cryptography, because I think that's still something that people generally don't understand the need for cryptography. But believe me, if you're going to still be building applications in 5 years' time and putting them on the internet, you must understand that stuff. This picture is not trying to suggest that we're going to run over Linux. This is actually a real road sign that I have seen. It's from Cape Town, where they have a suburb where there are penguins on the streets. And so this is a real risk. Lots of penguins, because they come in and hide from the sun under your car, and then you run them over when you leave the restaurant. But there is Linux involved here. The Remote Integrated Development Environment. I can't remember which conference it was where we first launched this idea. This has been a long ride. But we are actually giving you all a version of it now. We're making the first official release available for Windows only at this point. And the use cases that we are targeting with this first version are really people who are developing Unix or Linux applications and want to use a Windows desktop. At the moment, they are using a TTY character-based development environment. And with the RIDE, that really brings them into the whatever century it is we're in now, in terms of having a nice graphical user interface. For Windows users, the old development environment, the classical Windows IDE, will probably remain the tool of choice for at least another year or two, because it has much richer functionality. But if you have Windows services, things that are running in a remote location or perhaps in a secure location where you're not allowed to access the desktop of the service, then the RIDE will allow you a way to securely debug those applications, assuming you set up all the firewalls correctly and so on. So Jonathan and Nick will be talking about this afternoon. They're the main developers of that technology. Of course, as Gitte mentioned, there's been a number of twists in this tale. We started out with Silverlight and thought we could have a single user interface technology that would allow us to address, tablets, phones, Windows, Unix, everything. There was mono. It was the world looked really beautiful, but then it was taken away from us. So we thought, okay, we'll make two. We'll have Windows Presentation Foundation on the Windows desktop, and we'll use something called GTK, which is a cross-platform UI tool. But we've seen HTML, JavaScript mature much faster than we expected to, and then we had a JavaScript expert come on board. So we've decided that we will get rid of GTK and instead head for HTML5 JavaScript, which will give us a truly cross-platform ride in addition to the WPF one for Windows. So we're sort of placing a number of important bets. Parallel processing, we think, is soon going to be critical. These new platforms, as I said, are going to be really important. And we think that things have settled down a little bit. You're never quite sure about where everybody's going, but it looks like most user interfaces will either be HTML5 JavaScript for the web or WPF XAML. Don't worry about Quad WC Win32. It's going to be there for ages. So if you're really comfortable with that technology, it's probably fine for another while. But you probably impress people a lot more if you put in just one little WPF thing that did a bit of animation and looked a bit cool. They'd think you were really cool. Well, they would understand that you were really cool. So on the parallel processing, we're heading down sort of two avenues. In the short term, to give you access to parallel capability right here, right now, we have futures and isolates, where it's up to you to identify where the parallel sections of code are, but we've tried to provide a tool that makes that really easy. And then we're working on a compiler, JFode, who isn't here because he's expecting. Is there any news? His wife is expected to give birth last week, I think. So that's the only acceptable excuse almost for not coming to the conference as a Dyalog employee. But Nick is also working on that. So, and all of these tools are designed to sort of, you can use them right now, minimal recoding of your application. I'll be talking about these later this afternoon, did a workshop yesterday, and Nick is going to be talking about the compiler work that he and Jay are doing tomorrow afternoon. And then, looking further ahead, there are architectures, sort of very highly parallel architectures, GPUs and so on, that we don't think we can address with the other technologies, where a more radical approach is going to be necessary. And we've been funding Aaron Zhu's work at the University of Indiana for, I think, 2 or 3 years now, and continuing to do that. That's much more radical. It's going to require you to really refactor your applications into sort of the purely functional part, where you're not making database queries or anything like that, which obviously can't run on the GPU when it's compiled to run there, but has the potential to give you really massively parallel computations if that's successful. And Aaron's going to be talking about where he's at with that tomorrow after lunch. Maybe it'll actually be running again. On the new platforms, one thing that's curious, or maybe not so curious, but interesting, is that many of these new platforms actually are based on Unixes of one type or another. So the Raspberry Pi stuff, Apple is really Apple's OS X is a Unix system. Android is a Unix-based system, and then there's, of course, the Windows stuff. And the fact that Dyalog APL was born under Unix 30 years ago now turns out to be actually quite an advantage for us, because we've always kept, we've never become a Windows interpreter vendor, although it might seem that way to people using Quad WC. We've always kept the Unix stuff really healthy. And now we're sort of ramping that up. All the new tools that we are designing, the My Server, the RIDE, the R interface, the cryptographical library, all designed to be cross-platform. And some of the old ones, of course, many of the old ones already were. And as Gitte said, the goal is really that you should be able to develop a Dyalog APL application on any one of the platforms where we have APL and deploy it on any one of the others. Use the RIDE to get your development environment, and then have tools for user interfaces and connectivity that also work everywhere. And Andy isn't actually going to be talking so much about that in particular, but he's one of the champions of keeping us really alive on Unixes. He's our AIX expert. Jason has been doing a lot of work on the deployment of Dyalog APL on platforms and trying to make that a homogeneous experience. So in the past, you've only really been able to patch Windows systems automatically from the internet, and we've been working on ways to make sort of the patching and so on work the same way across platforms, and Jason's going to be talking about that this afternoon. And of course Jeff, who's not speaking at this conference, but is the, where is he? There he is, the Unix champion, the real big AIX and Unix champion. Okay, so we've already talked about this a fair amount. We think cross-platform applications will use this trio of technologies, HTML and JavaScript I mentioned, and CSS for all the pretty pictures and the colors to get them right. Desktop applications, new ones that want to impress users that are in a competitive marketplace where the user interface is really important. Probably WPF. We're going to be working on something called data binding, which allows you to essentially share variables between your APL workspace and your user interfaces for both of these technologies. And that enables something called model view model as an architecture for your applications, where you really separate the business logic and just expose data to a user interface that can be implemented using any technology. And I say cross-platform here, but of course one of the things that's interesting about HTML solution, and something that we're starting to see a lot on handheld devices, is that people will actually use HTML, JavaScript as a way to define a user interface, but then they'll run it locally on the device. And of course there's no reason why you can't do that on a Windows desktop as well. So one thing I hope to see appear quite soon is embedded HTML, JavaScript rendering component embedded with Dyalog APL, or very tightly integrated with Dyalog APL. So you can write a user interface with HTML5 JavaScript, and then you can either use the My Server or reroute it via IIS or Apache, some other web server, and produce a web application. Or you can just use this container to present the same user interface on your desktop. That, I think, is likely to become, for at least 5 years, maybe 10, sort of the dominant user interface technology. You'll be able to find lots of people on the market who understand that. Yep. So John's going to be talking about the data binding work, which started last year and will be continuing in 14.1. Right, so those were the bets, sort of the big bets. But of course, there are still a few things left to put into the language. We're actually, there's not that many. If you look around at other array languages, we're now pretty complete. But there are some exciting things left that you know, the NARS people have done, and K and J there, and Sharp APL. Operators cut, which is something which allows you to take an array and tessellate it, cut it into pieces of regular or irregular size, and apply a function to that. So for example, the game of life would become only that long if you had cut, because you could just say 3 cut or something and then a plus reduction, and that would be the whole thing. Closures is something John Scholes has been talking about for years. Functional programmers use closures as alternative to objects, so they probably would shoot me for saying it that way. But it's something that is really, it's a big missing piece for if we really want to sell Dyalog APL as a functional programming language, we need to put closures in. And I think the script, the emphasis on using scripts to store source code means that it's probably time for us to come up with a notation for constants in the language, so that in your script you can declare matrices and so on in a nice readable fashion. There are some potential new data types that we might look at. These have been lurking for years and sort of never become important enough to put in. But I think the scalar string type, perhaps in particular, as we try and interoperate with .NET and Java platforms, which really see a character vector as a fundamentally different structure from a scalar string type, it may be time to do that. And we're not talking about any of these at this conference, but you can expect at Dyalog14 to have much more focus when we're talking about the features of version 15.0. There'll be a number of papers on this by members of the team. And we've sort of pledged that rather than just waiting to the conference, we're going to start blogging and talking about these well in advance of the conference and hopefully get some feedback. Okay. And on the tools side, the sort of the big frontier that we can see looming ahead of us is that we need a general module mechanism that everybody is going to share, or at least all the new users would share, to make it very easy to make a module and for people to declare a dependency on it, and it just gets automatically loaded into the system. When you build your system for deployment, it just gets brought together. And a standard project structure so that all or a large number of new applications will have the same structure, and it'll be easy for developers to move from one system to the next. Standard cross-platform libraries to go with that you can declare dependencies on and just have appear in your code. And of course, make all of these new modules available as open source repositories on GitHub. So version 14 is going to be, as I said, mostly completion. Speeding things up is something sort of a big part of our time that we do for every single release. Get the compiler, which is in version 14.0, but at the moment sort of a bit of it's a toy. It can't really impact the performance of your application. But now that the technology is integrated and working, the goal for 14.1 is to get it to the point where if you use the compiler, you'll be able to measure a speed up in a typical application. The futures and isolates, which are sort of experimental in 14.0, get those to industrial strength. And there's always more data binding to new APL structures. And I'm running out of time, so the people who know about that problem will appreciate that one. We will be breaking a little bit of sort of fundamental ground in 14.1. We hope to have a Java bridge, an initial version of the Java bridge in there. I'm not quite sure we'll be able to do that yet. The target is to officially, for the first time, support Apple OS X. You'll be able to run Dyalog APL, an official version of Dyalog APL on a Macintosh. And the next presentation by John Daintree is going to be about this first item here, the work that we're doing to really make the Quad WC side of Dyalog APL capable of dealing with touch devices and high DPI monitors in 2 minutes. You've seen all of these in previous talks. Nothing has really changed here. Move in a functional direction if you want to take advantage of parallel programming and the compilers. Learn about security now, at least. Concentrate in Björn's talk and start to understand the kind of things you may need to do to protect your data. Please use the tools that we publish on GitHub, give us feedback and help develop them. We can't do it all. And send us your benchmark code and your Applemon data if you have it to guide the performance work. And there's 1 minute to go. So the final slide is about the perils of not following those recommendations. As you know, the Vikings believed that if you sailed far enough, you see, this blue line doesn't go all the way across. So, and this is an archaeologically reconstructed sign. So listen up. And and I've left 1 minute for questions. But I mean, I was really just introducing all these talks. Come to the talks and ask the questions there. Yeah, was there one question?
Morten, you talked about closures and the aspects of functional languages. I think the most obvious omission and one of the most powerful things that could be added to APL is user-defined data types, because those give you much better control over analysis of applications, as well as freeing us from the tyranny of the implementer in terms of adding effectively new data types, although albeit without the performance benefits of the implementer.
And I think what's made it really impractical to have user-defined data types in APL until now is the fact that we had no compiler, because I think to get just reasonably decent performance on user-defined data type, you must have a compiler. That's my take on it anyway. But now we have compiler technology coming on board, so that may become practical. Okay. John Daintree is next. Thank you.